Hello everyone and welcome to History Hunters! My name is Dreadlocks Mackenzie and today we're looking at the Russian Revolution of 1917. Why do we have to study the Russian Revolution? Why can't we look at the French Revolution instead? The American Revolution invented freedom. No. Unfortunately, I'm going to upset all of the dirty communists out there, but this video is mainly about the circumstances that brought down the monarchy. So that means no Lenin, no Trotsky, no Stalin and that amazing haircut. They have to wait their turn. Instead, we're going to look at the failures of the state, the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, and the effect that World War I had on the empire. The Russian revolutions are pretty crazy. They brought an end to a 300-year-old dynasty, completely changed the political and social structure of the world's largest country, and gave rise to the Soviet Union. This caused the Cold War, which would dominate the world's landscape for over 40 years and bring about the current reality we have of just a few people holding the power to eliminate all of humanity. Several times over. But first, we've got to go back. Way back to 1914, before the First World War broke out, when there was no Soviet Union. Instead, we had the Russian Empire, which looked a little like this. It stretched from Poland in the west all the way to the Pacific Ocean in the east and was the largest continuous land empire in the world. It had the largest population in the world at roughly 170 million and the largest army as well, but just because you have a large army doesn't make you actually good at fighting. On paper, the Russian Empire should have been one of the preeminent powers on the continent, but it wasn't. It was an empire in serious decline for a number of reasons. There was a profound economic over-reliance on agriculture, which made up over half of the national income and employed over 2/3 of the population, despite being one of the most inefficient in Europe. And ruling over starving people is hard work. Although there was a massive increase in the Russian industrial capacity towards the late 1800s, much of this was financed by Western banks, which, in turn, caused debt to quickly spiral out of control, and by the time the 1900s rolled around, the makings of a financial crisis had begun to take shape. The Tsar was an autocrat, and he exercised absolute power. So, naturally, when the people were like, "Hey man, do you want to kick us some of them basic human rights?" Pyotr, get the rifles. All of this made the rabble of the empire pretty unruly, and respect for central authority was in a pretty bad way before the war had even broken out. So the First World War is known by a lot of different names, such as the War to End All Wars, which is of course wrong. Or the Great War, although if you fought in it, you probably wouldn't even describe it as good. This was one of the first true industrial wars, where entire economies would be reworked to support the war effort, and new technologies such as tanks, aircraft, gas, and machine guns would be used to kill millions. By its conclusion, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and, of course, the Russian Empire would all meet their end. Russia was pulled into the war in an effort to defend their ally Serbia from Austria-Hungary. And to say that the war was a disaster for the Russians is kind of like saying that Nazis are bad or that star wipes are tacky and annoying. You don't say. We aren't going to go into too much detail about World War I because it's a big topic and that's too much work and I'm lazy, but for context's sake, the Russians began the war by invading eastern Germany with two armies totaling a combined roughly 700,000 men. Displaying that true early 20th century Russian military skill, they would be outmaneuvered, surrounded, and then promptly destroyed by a single German army of only 250,000 men. Great job. From this point, the Russians would adopt a bold new strategy of retreating continuously until the peace treaty was signed. The Russian army's mad skills can almost be looked at as a representation of the entire country, really. The army was poorly trained, terribly led, and ill-equipped. The roads were in a state of disrepair, and the Russian railway system broke down like 3 days before the war even began. By 1915, food production had fallen and starvation had begun to set in across the country. What a recipe for success. So what about the Tsar? Nicholas II is kind of like the Russian monarchy's equivalent of that feeling you get when you're 3 hours from home and you can't remember if you've left the stove on. Are you going to come home to a burning wreck? Probably. To be fair though, Nicholas was never really taught how to actually rule. His dad, the old Tsar, died unexpectedly in 1894 at a young age, without giving his son any formal training or responsibility. After he passed away, Nicky actually was quoted as asking, "What is going to happen to me? And all of Russia?" In that order. Of course, the man had his priorities straight. His resistance to any changes can be kind of explained since he did witness the assassination of his grandfather, Tsar Alexander II, and that dude was like the most liberal reformer the empire had ever seen. But this begs the question, if one can understand how the circumstances of Nicholas's life would point him in the inflexible direction his rule would take, does that excuse the failures of his reign? Alright, back to the war. By September 1915, the Russian army had become more or less the German punching bag, so Nicholas had a terrible idea. He appointed himself as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Even though Nicholas was not really involved in any military planning, and his duties were mostly ceremonial, any and all failures from this point onwards would be placed firmly on his shoulders. And boy were there. This new role would see him spend the majority of his time out of the capital, St. Petersburg, leaving it in the hands of the Tsarina, his wife Alexandra, and if you're familiar with Boney M, Rasputin, Russia's greatest love machine, in control of the government. I wish I could go into more detail about this creepy man, but I really don't have the time. All you need to know is that he somehow managed to treat the young Prince Alexei's haemophilia and saved him from certain death on more than one occasion. He then used this as an in to take control of the government and wield an undue amount of influence over the Tsarina. Not bad for a peasant from the middle of nowhere. In late 1916, though, he would be murdered in a pretty amateurish way by a group of unruly nobles who were concerned about the damage he was doing to the Tsar's reputation. Essentially, they were going against the direct wishes of Nicholas, which is something almost unprecedented in the Russian Empire. Less than 3 months after this, Nicholas would be forced to abdicate the throne in the face of mass demonstrations and mutinies against him. This began the end of Romanov rule of Russia. So in light of the total collapse of control in the capital, and with soldiers either refusing to fire on protesters or crossing over to join them directly, Nicholas abdicated the throne in favour of his brother, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, on the 15th of March 1917, so-called the February Revolution, because why not? Michael wanted absolutely nothing to do with this and refused to take the throne, and so the Romanov monarchy ended not with the bang, but with the whimper. In its place, the Duma took over as the government of Russia and renamed itself the Provisional Government. Catchy name. This was an elected parliamentary body that mostly included liberals and other members who advocated for a democratic system and a constitution that would assist in modernising the country. A man named Alexander Kerensky would become the leader of this new body, and he was immediately stuck with the difficult task of trying to, rule? Why? Petrograd Soviet. Oh, by the way, St. Petersburg and Petrograd, they're the same thing, just so you know. Moving on. The Petrograd Soviet was a council of peasants, workers, and soldiers that served as a kind of lobbying body to pressure the provisional government to act in the way that the Soviet wanted. This made it really difficult for the government to disagree or ignore them. I mean, you do have the peasants who make up the vast majority of the population, the workers who are responsible for pretty much all of the industrial production, and the soldiers who, had guns. So of course this system of dual power couldn't last, and surprise, surprise, it didn't. It's time for Australia's favourite game show. Let's play Who Killed the Provisional Government? We have the system of dual power we mentioned earlier that really hamstrung the ability of Alexander Kerensky to, govern. We have World War I, which they continued to fight in and continued to suck at. And last but not least, we have the Kornilov Affair. So Tsar Kornilov was a high-ranking general in the Russian army, who you can see here getting his massive ego carried around by his officer corps. In response to yet more large-scale demonstrations against the provisional government and just general unrest in the military, he decided to do something really dumb. He took his army and marched on Petrograd to seize control of the government. This left Kerensky in a pretty tough position. He needed to defend the city somehow, so he decided to release socialist Bolsheviks from prison, give them some guns in order to effectively defend the city. Never mind that they were put in prison for trying to overthrow the government in the first place. That's in the past. So Kerensky just freed and armed his biggest political opposition in an attempt to defend the city from a military general looking to take over the country.
That was good.
You can see how this is going to go well. Sure enough, the Bolsheviks turned Kornilov back from the city, and their popularity soared, while that of the provisional government fell to an all-time low. Kerensky had now lost the support of the peasantry, the workers, the sailors, the soldiers, the middle-class businessmen, and just about everyone in the major cities. The Bolsheviks now won majorities in elections to the Soviets in cities like Petrograd, Kiev, Bryansk, and pretty much every major city in the country. The fall of the government seemed pretty much inevitable. On the 25th of October 1917, the Bolshevik-led Red Guards captured key government facilities and communication points, and by 2 a.m. the next day, the Winter Palace was stormed and the Provisional Government surrendered. There was so little resistance that only 18 people were arrested and 2 killed, and much of Petrograd fell under Bolshevik control without a single shot being fired. And this ends the October Revolution. I'd like to finish this video by talking about the nature of change. Change is an inevitable part of life, both for governments and individuals. The choice of whether to go out and party instead of doing your assignment, whether to tell that boy or girl you want to be more than just friends, or maybe just going out and overthrowing the government seem to be worlds apart. But in truth, they're all tied together through the decisions we make as people. Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, could have waited to see how things played out, like many urged him to, but instead he decided to seize his chance, just as Alexander Kerensky decided to keep fighting in World War I. Change can be a scary thing, and if I was to offer my unwanted opinion, I'd say that the Bolshevik Revolution was overall a pretty negative event. It is easy to say that with the benefits of hindsight, but I mean, it did lead to a civil war in which millions more would die, then Stalin after that, and then famines and repression after that, and then total collapse only 75 years later. The benefit to studying history is to look back and understand how many aspects of our existence rest on small, knife-edge decisions, and while it can be comfortable to wonder what our lives would be like if things were a little bit different, it's worth understanding that decisions that aren't made change nothing, and if you want to improve your life, you have to make the conscious choice to go after it, even if things don't always go as planned. Thank you so much for watching. I had an absolute blast making this. If you want to see me make more of this, I absolutely would love to. Feel free to comment down below or subscribe. That'd be really appreciate. Fuck.
It's gonna be the hardest one.
The hardest part to be like
I've got the mental block of like this.
I know what I'm gonna do. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, fuck. Even better. Make this ultra douchebaggy.